to foster security, stability, and prosperity in Africa. This remains our purpose today.
The United States has brought together the top military chiefs of Africa. Its stated aim to help in the fight against armed groups such as Boko Haram and Al-Shabab. But can America help secure stability in a continent that's battling violence on so many fronts? And are critics right to question Washington's real motives? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. The United States is hosting a conference for defence chiefs from 40 African countries. The meeting's taking place in Germany at the headquarters of the United States Africa Command, or AFRICOM.
We strive to enhance our partner capacity. We want to help you become more capable in the areas where you need assistance, such as training to secure your borders, training to secure outlying areas, and training perhaps with the security challenges of the coastal regions of those countries that applies to. At the same time, we gain an opportunity to make our own soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines better and more professional as they work and train side by side with your soldiers.
Paul Brennan has more from the conference.
40 African nations are represented here in Stuttgart, and clearly the biggest beneficiary will be the United States, which has invited the delegates here because it's the United States which will forge the deeper understandings, the strategic partnerships with nations all across the continent. But there is no doubt that the African nations themselves will benefit hugely through, for example, the possibility of increasing their military capabilities, doing deals for weapons, for example. One of the most surprising and perhaps most reasons for optimism coming out of this meeting is also the realization that the military chiefs recognize the complexity of the problems that Africa faces, particularly in regard to what they describe as VEOs, that is, violent extremist organizations such as Boko Haram, ISIL, Al-Shabab. It's said that people who have a hammer regard every problem as a nail to be hit. Well, these are the people who are holding the hammers in Africa, and yet they know, and they've explicitly described, that socioeconomic problems such as famine, humanitarian crises, unemployment, these are the driving forces that feed the militant groups, the fighting groups, and that those issues also have to be addressed at the same time as the military options are explored. And that in itself is room for optimism from this meeting.
Well, the conference is taking place just days after the Trump administration announced it was going ahead with the sale of high-tech aircraft to Nigeria for its campaign against the armed group Boko Haram. Former President Barack Obama had agreed on the sale, but it was delayed after the Nigerian Air Force bombed a refugee camp in January. Mohammed Ado reports from the capital, Abuja.
Across northeast Nigeria, vigilantes, often armed but only with rudimentary weapons, are joining the fight against Boko Haram. Until February 2014, when more than 270 girls were abducted by the armed group from their CHIBOK village, these men were minding their businesses as hunters, farmers, bricklayers and carpenters. These days they are the ones asking questions at the roadblocks in the village.
Boko Haram cannot dare to come here. We have taught them a lesson on many occasions. Our only challenge are the rifles we have. They're too old. We need better arms.
The deployment of men armed with just arrows, machetes and old Russian hunting rifles may be considered by some a damning indictment of the Nigerian military. For a long time, though, Nigeria has struggled to access arms in the international market due to a U.S. arms embargo imposed because of the country's poor human rights record. Officials say this is why Nigeria was forced to buy arms on the black market and from Russia. But there does appear to be a change of heart from the U.S., with President Donald Trump approving the deal to sell Nigeria 12 Embraer Air-29 Super TUCANO fighter aircrafts. It's the price tag of $600 million, more than a half of Nigeria's annual defense budget, that has shocked many.
It is too much to commit that kind of amount to buying aircrafts alone. to the detriment of the Army, the Navy, the other regular forces, the police, and the local vigilante. That has also been very helpful.
Despite the U.S. government's previous unwillingness to sell arms to Nigeria, its military has been very much involved in the fight against Boko Haram, primarily through providing intelligence support. It's an operation overseen by the U.S. Africa Command, or AFRICOM, based in Germany. Established 10 years ago, AFRICOM is responsible for U.S. military operations and military relations with African armies.
America is interested in world peace, at least fighting terrorism worldwide. So this is a platform where I think various countries will come together to discuss issues of common interest and bring stability within the continental platform.
Critics say AFRICOM is all about playing catch-up with China, which has replaced the U.S. as Africa's biggest trading partner. But whether AFRICOM is a scheme to protect U.S. interests disguised as military partnerships or not, the U.S. is now dealing with a continent increasingly less beholden to American dictates. Mohamed Ado, Abuja, Nigeria.
Well, let's bring in our guests. In Washington, D.C., we have Reuben Brigety, Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He also served as the U.S. Ambassador to the African Union. In Pretoria, South Africa, Martin Iwi, Senior Researcher at the International Crime in Africa Programme at the Institute for Security Studies. And also in Washington, Rose Jackson, a Senior Policy Advisor at the Secure Partnerships Initiative at Open Society. Welcome, all of you. Reuben, how significant is this conference that we're seeing in Germany? I mean, getting the US and some 40 African defence ministers in one room, it's a pretty big deal, isn't it?
It is a big deal, and it is significant principally because it demonstrates the maturing of the relationship between AFRICOM and various African security partners on the continent. When the organization AFRICOM was first stood up in 2007, the PR, if you will, for the command did not go very well. And there was a great deal of suspicion across the continent about the motives of AFRICOM. So now, some 7 years later, for 40 African defense ministers to go to AFRICOM headquarters in Germany for discussions of mutual security issues, I think shows a real turning in the nature of that relationship and also signals possibilities for that relationship in the future.
Okay. Martin, as Reuben says, there was initially quite a lot of suspicion on both sides from the US and from the African countries. I mean, that perhaps was why the headquarters were based where they are in Germany. That was supposed to be a temporary solution. But why are they still there? Does that suspicion still exist?
Well, to some extent, one will say so. The African continent recently embarked on common, or what we call collective security. And that collective security concept meant that there were not supposed to be military bases or foreign military bases in Africa. AFRICOM was to be one of those military bases which are on the continent. And because it was still to come to the continent, they said, no, this will not be conducive to the kind of environment that we are trying to build, because we're trying to build a concept of security where it is African solution to African problems. And therefore, AFRICOM is still, to that extent, still very suspicious, because many see it to be intrusive into the nature of sovereignty on the continent. We still have former colonial masters who have military bases on the continent. Some have bilateral military arrangement, which are not really suitable for the kind of collective security concept that the African Union was building, particularly when you look at the African Common Defense and Security Pact, or the Non-Aggression Pact. That didn't really augur well for states like the US, which were bringing their military bases to the continent. And I think the African people are ready to go to any headquarters outside Africa where AFRICOM is based, or where foreign partners have their military bases or command structures for the continent. They are ready to go there, but they are not willing to receive, an elaborate infrastructure, military infrastructure on the continent, which will pose a threat to the security and national sovereignty of many of the countries.
Rose, when you see so many different parties coming together, can we identify one or two common goals?
I think it's very clear that as I was mentioned in the intro, that a core goal and a set of concerns that many of these countries are focused on is the question of battling violent extremist groups, the rising threat of Boko Haram across a number of countries, the continued fight against AQIM in the Sahel, as well as the ongoing fight against Al-Shabaab in Somalia. It is encouraging to hear that there is a recognition that military action and military solutions alone will not be able to solve those core problems facing many countries on the continent. But I would be surprised if the conversations moved too far away from that core set of interests and issues.
What about critics, Rose, who say that the US is ultimately only interested in securing economic resources in Africa? Is there some truth in that?
I personally haven't seen anything that directs US action exclusively towards economic interests. If anything, the criticism perhaps rings more true when it is directed towards the focus on security as a core interest for the United States, and that its actions and partnerships with many African countries has been operationalized through that set of interests. We've heard many people talk about the militarization of the relationship and the focal point on violent extremism over the concerns of a growing youth population that will need to be involved in developing economies, in the growth of the middle class and economic opportunities, or risk becoming perhaps a destabilizing presence in many countries. I don't think we've seen evidence that the United States has prioritized economic interests over security interests.
Okay. Reuben, do you see there being, over the past few years and today, a US pivot to Africa? I mean, to what extent does the US have its military footprint on the continent?
Well, there's no doubt that for a variety of reasons, on a bipartisan basis, American foreign policymakers and the U.S. military in particular paid much more attention to Africa. So, for example, the reason that AFRICOM is headquartered in Germany as opposed to anywhere else is that the U.S. European Command used to have responsibility for both all of Europe and Africa. And as a result of that dual responsibility, Africa always got short shrift. So the view of then Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld is, why not create a command exclusively focused on Africa so that we can have an entire staff and a series of forces dedicated to partnering with African militaries and advancing U.S. interests, security interests on the continent. So that's why it happens to be in Germany. But one can also see under the Obama administration, whether it be the first ever Africa Leader Summit that brought almost every African head of state to Washington in August 2014, the increased move to help support American economic engagement on Africa, particularly with regard to Power Africa. I mean, these are all things that are demonstrative of the recognition that Africa is increasingly important in its own right, that is increasingly important as a source of economic opportunity, but also that there are significant security issues that have to be addressed if Africa is to achieve its full potential, both for itself as well as a potential partner for the United States. And that, I think, is what is driving the maturation on both sides of the relationship between AFRICOM and various defense partners on the continent.
Okay. Martin, is that the driver from the African side of the equation? I mean, what do African countries want from the US in this partnership?
I think they are already having that cooperation that they want. I think what we need is to intensify it and for the cooperation to be more frank, because sometimes you get the feeling that some of the partners or the partner on the other side could be the US, could be a European partner, they are hiding something. I think what the Africans, they expect from the US, particularly from the Africa Command, is to intensify the kind of programs that they've been having, which is the training programs that they've been having. But one key flaw of this training, which many have appreciated, is that when they come to countries, I think they recently did a training in the Zambia, when they come to countries, they come with this very high-tech training, then they come also with the equipment. But after the training, they take away the equipment, and these people are left with the skills, but without the equipment. And therefore, after some time, these skills, they die off, they've never been used, and in some cases, these people are given the equipment but not the training. So I think if they can really reconcile these two, I think it will help a lot for the African people, because that's what they've been looking for. They want training, they also want the equipment, which most often they don't have. So if AFRICOM can really address these gaps, I think it will be well appreciated. There is already a huge appreciation for what they are doing already for the continent, particularly the trainings that they bring to many of Africa's military in areas where, otherwise they would not have had the skills.
I mean, Reuben, we did hear there in the beginning of the program from the US in Germany at the conference saying that training was one of the key drivers of this relationship. Do you agree there with Martin that there is this gap and it can be improved?
Yes, there is a gap. Yes, it can be improved, and yes, it is being improved. One of the things about training is that it's perishable. So the same group of the same infantry battalion that you train today will not have the exact same composition a year from now. It may not be the exact same unit. They will have the same mission. The same people that did the training on the U.S. side this year may not be the same people next year. So this is why the nature of the relationship is very important, to be able to continue to cycle through those sorts of training packages and frankly develop those sorts of training relationships so that units can always be at the best possible state of training that partners like the United States have to offer. On the equipment issue, this is something that is really quite serious. As I think you noted in the initial segment from Nigeria, for example, the decision to buy very expensive Embraer aircraft as opposed to providing for the same amount of money, land vehicles, small arms, small unit communications equipment, all the kinds of things that would enable light infantry forces of the Nigerian military to engage more actively on the ground against Boko Haram. I mean, these are really serious trade-offs. And the challenge with the train and equip mission is trying to figure out what is the right source of equipment packages can be offered to militaries that are operating on a budget. And that have limited financial resources, but they're nevertheless good enough to be able to achieve the missions that their countries ask them to achieve.
Rose, on a slightly different point, if we're looking at the sale of these fighter jets to Nigeria, I mean, this was delayed under Obama due to human rights concerns. It's now going ahead. Are we sensing a change of heart here from the Trump administration?
I think there's no question that this administration has signaled that democracy and human rights concerns certainly are not at the forefront of American policy for the president. The announcement that we're focusing on fighting violent extremism and security first. That said, the planes in question have been under discussion for, I think, close to 3 years, and on 3 separate occasions were held up. As you referenced earlier in the segment, this set of planes was put on hold after a bombing by the Nigerian Air Force that resulted in a number of deaths at an IDP camp. And at the end of an administration, I think a decision was made to put it on hold and allow the next administration to choose whether to move forward. That said, I'm not confident that there would have been a completely different outcome had we been looking at a different administration or if Obama was still president. But I think the broader question for the continent is, does this signal very clearly that there will be perhaps more patience for human rights abuses and patience for the dynamics that we've seen over many years that undermine the effectiveness of our assistance and undermine the effectiveness of the forces that are combating very serious terrorist threats, such as Boko Haram? What do countries take away from that signal? But I wouldn't read too much into this particular release.
Okay, so Martin, speaking more broadly, does it concern you that there might be more patience, as Rose says, for human rights abuses in this current US administration?
Well, I think we will see something like that the administration is turning away from human rights issues. It's more and more focusing on counterterrorism in complete disregard of human rights concerns. And I don't see how this kind of strategy can win the fight against terrorism. So what we are expecting to see is that this is going to trigger more terrorists. around the world, in Africa included, if human right is disregarded blatantly, as we have seen. I think that there is a need to have that clear balance between the fight against terrorism and human rights concern and the protection of human rights. Because if you don't protect human rights, you're going to anger more people who are going to join these terrorist groups in order to revenge the wrongs that have been done onto them. So therefore, I don't see where the administration is going with this. I think it is time to rethink and to see how to reconcile the need that everyone recognizes to fight terrorism, and also that's important, or the imperative to protect human rights.
Reuben, it was interesting to note from our correspondent at the conference, delegates there recognizing that in order to achieve security, one does need to address social issues. He didn't say human rights issues, but he did say humanitarian issues. Does that give you some reason to hope that the two will go hand in hand?
Well, everybody who's ever looked at this sort of series of complex security challenges, whether it be in Africa, in the United States, or Europe, everybody understands the basic framework, which is that not only are there times when direct military action is necessary, but you ultimately have to address root causes of ideology, of unemployment, and whatnot. But the issue with regard to the Trump administration, as it relates to both addressing these socioeconomic concerns and also the broader issues of human rights, is that its policy thus far is completely incoherent. On the one hand, President Trump in his inaugural speech said America first, and that America will not seek to tell the nations how to govern themselves, which is a very veiled slide of saying that we're not going to be talking about human rights or democracy as much anymore. On the other hand, the president did a 180-degree change on his Syria policy, deciding to launch cruise missiles into Syria on the basis of a grave violation of international humanitarian law when the Syrian military used chemical weapons. On the one hand, we have his ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, absolutely condemning, appropriately in my view, the rounding up of gay men in Chechnya. On the other hand, we have the president saying that essentially human rights are not going to be a major issue in engagement with China. So they are all over the place, and it's hard. This is always a tension in American foreign policy, but there's absolutely no clear direction of how it's going to govern U.S. policy towards Africa. And one other thing, if I may. The other major issue is if you're going to address the core issues that are related to conflict, poverty, whatnot, that necessarily means that you're going to have to be continuing to address issues of economic development, humanitarian assistance, at the same time as this administration has signaled a dramatic cut in its desire anyway for a dramatic cut in foreign assistance dollars. So it is anybody's guess where they are going to land on this, but what is certain is if they actually want to be serious security partners for Africa to address these broad sets of issues, they cannot back away from longstanding American commitments, bipartisan commitments with regard to the importance of democracy and human rights, nor can they back away from longstanding bipartisan commitments to work with Africa on matters of economic development.
Rose, we've got the Defence Secretary James Mattis due to be visiting the US base in Djibouti next week. Are we hoping that we're going to hear some answers to some of those questions that Reuben raises there?
I think this is part of the bigger issue that Reuben is signaling to. The United States of America is not just the United States military. Yet, as we see a disempowered State Department, talks of significant cuts to the civilian apparatus of the U.S. government, we're relying increasingly on signals, conversations, and actions from the U.S. military. So a great deal of pressure is placed on Mattis to answer a lot of questions that frankly are outside of his remit. I think perhaps we'll see greater clarity about what the way forward is on the mission in Somalia. We certainly have a new government there and a lot of, I think, potential excitement around the possibility of political progress within the confines of the space that the AMISOM security operation provides. But beyond that, I think we're setting ourselves up for disappointment if we expect the U.S. military not only to be able to answer U.S. foreign policy questions that to this point are quite unclear, but also to be able to solve the issues that the United States continues to try and address on the continent. As Reuben said, I don't think there's a way forward for the benefit of African countries or for the projection of U.S. interests that involves only the military. We cannot tackle these issues through one tool of our government.
Plenty of questions still to be answered, but unfortunately today we have run out of time for this discussion here on Inside Story. Thanks very much to all our guests, Reuben, Brigety, Martin Uwe and Rose Jackson. And thank you too very much for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here. Bye for now.